Hello everybody, welcome to jurycentral.com online classes for law exams. So today I will be dealing with you the subjective questions of Jamia LLM Entrance Exam 2017. These are fully solved paper. So yesterday I have uploaded a subjective paper of the year 2018. So I will be only reading the answers to you. If you have any issues, you can share the same in the comment section below. Because in case if I try to explain each and every answer, then the session will go long. And the last time when I uploaded the session, it was of 1.5 hours. So this is the reason why I am trying to finish this off in a short span of time. So follow my words. And before starting this session, I would request all of you to kindly like and subscribe to the channel if you do not want to miss such updates. So people, let us start. So the reason why I am not using the camera, because if I start using the camera, then the slides will be hidden off. So let us start. Answer any 6 questions. All questions carry equal marks in 500 words. So there will be a subjective question of 10, and you have to answer any 6 answers, any 6 questions of your choice, and you have to limit your answer within 500 words. And also people, let me tell you, you have to score at least 30% in the subjective part to get qualified for the LLM entrance examination. So let us see. Question number 1. Elaborate the law relating to immunity from criminal liability to child offenders which is provided under sections 82 and 83 of the Indian Penal Code. Refer to relevant case law. So let us start. So while we are answering subjective questions, we shall keep it in mind that we shall start the answer from introduction and will end in conclusion, and we shall also include the relevant provisions if the question is asking, or case law is a must show. You have to mention at least one case laws in every question. But suppose if the question is relating to jurisprudence or public international law, you are not required to mention any case laws. But if you think that mentioning of any case laws is important for the relevant subject, then you can do so. So let us start. Introduction. According to the Indian Majority Act, a person domiciled in India is said to have attained the age of majority after turning 18 years. Therefore, any person below this prescribed age is said to be a minor. Under the Juvenile Justice Act of 2000, juveniles or minors are considered to be those who have completed the age of 18 years. It can be concluded that in order to be liable for an offence as an adult, a person must have completed the age of 18 years. I hope you understood this point. Any wrong or mistake committed by a child is not the same as one committed by an adult due to the level of maturity that is expected out of them. Cases such as Ramdev Chauhan versus Bani Kant Das. So this is one example of case law. However, this provision has some exceptions. According to the Indian Penal Code, an offence committed by a child below 7 years is not considered as an offence, but an act done by a child above 7 years and below 12 years is said to be an offence under certain circumstances as prescribed under the code. So section 82 deals with doli in capax, and section 83 deals with any child who is above 7 years but below 12 years is said to have committed the offence if he has the sufficient level of maturity and understanding what he has committed. Then principle of doli in capax. The law presumes that a child below the age of 7 years is doli in capax. This means that the child lacks necessary ability to understand the nature and consequences of the act committed by them, and thereby lacks the ability to form a mens rea. That means if a crime has been done by a child under 7 years of age, then that is not a punishable offence. Doli in capax is a Latin term meaning incapable of doing harm, which has been used to presume the innocence of a child under criminal law. So a relevant case law has been given in the case of Kaku versus State of Himachal Pradesh. The accused of 13 years of age had committed the offence of rape on a 2 years of age and was thereby sentenced to 4 years of rigorous imprisonment by the trial court, which was upheld by the High Court on pleading sections 82 and 83 of the IPC. The court took into account the circumstances of the case and opined that the punishment shall be reduced to 1 year of rigorous imprisonment with a fine, along with 6 months of rigorous imprisonment for default in payment of fine. The convict was also said to be kept separate from the adult prisoner. So a child who is below 18 years of age shall not be kept in a prison cell which is in which an adult is also kept. Like he shall not be kept in a jail, but he can be kept in a correction home. Legal provisions, Indian Penal Code, Section 82 and 83 of the IPC deals with offence committed by children. Section 82 states that nothing is an offence which is done by a child under 7 years of age. This provision gives a total immunity to children below the age of 7 years from being charged, tried and convicted for any offence prescribed under the IPC or other legal provisions. The relevant case law is Shyam Bahadur Koeri versus State of Bihar, in which a child below the age of 7 years discovered a gold plate that weighed 28 tolas. However, after recovering it, he did not report it to the collector. When the collector came to know of this, he ordered the prosecution of the child under the Indian Treasure Trove Act 1878. The court acquitted the child, holding that he had the benefit of Section 82 of the child as he was below 7 years of age. And let us read what Section 83 says. Section 83 of the IPC states that nothing is an offence which is done by a child above 7 years of age and under 12 and who has not attained sufficient maturity of understanding to judge of the nature and consequences of his conduct on that occasion. This section deals with offences committed by a child above the age of 7 years but below the age of 12 years. To prosecute a child under this section, the following essentials must be satisfied. The act must be done by a child. The child must be above 7 years and below 12 years of age. The child must not have attained sufficient maturity to understand the nature and consequences of their conduct. So these are the essentials to be satisfied. In the case of Hiralal Malik versus State of Bihar, in this case, a 12-year-old boy along with two other people was convicted of murdering a person. The High Court convicted the child under Section 326 of IPC based on the circumstances revolving around the crime. The 12-year-old boy had struck the neck of the deceased with a sword and run away after the act. There was no evidence to suggest that he did not have the maturity or understanding of the consequences of his act, and therefore the conviction under Section 326 of IPC was upheld. Then we will also study about the provisions given in a juvenile justice care and protection of children. So to understand the crimes committed by minors, it is also necessary to study the JJ Act of 2000, which prescribes the procedure relating to crimes committed by minors. As mentioned earlier, the JJ Act deals with offences committed by persons who have not completed the age of 18 years. So even under this JJ Act, and a child can also be tried as an adult. In certain cases, the child can be tried as an adult. When a heinous offence is committed by a child between the age of 16 to 18 years, the child shall first be produced before the JJ board. The board shall then conduct a preliminary assessment of the accused, assessing the capacity of the child to commit such an offence and assessing whether the child is able to understand the consequences of the offence. After such an assessment, the board shall decide whether the child shall be tried as an adult. So, in the case of Pratap Singh versus State of Jharkhand, there was a question before the court that whether the date of commission of an offence or the date on which the accused was produced before the court should be considered. In this case, the Supreme Court held that the date of the commission of the offence should be recognized as the date of determining the age of the accused. So, let us come to the conclusion part. A child is unable for an offence if they are above 7 years of age and below 12 years of age and has the ability to understand the nature and consequences of their action. In addition, an offence committed by a child of 16 to 18 years of age will also hold the child liable if the offence committed is a heinous one and if preliminary assessment proved that such a child was able to understand the consequences of their actions. However, in most cases, the conviction or acquittal of the accused child is based on the facts and circumstances of the case, as there are specific guidelines that govern such conviction. Then question number 2, initial impossibility renders an agreement void and subsequent impossibility renders a contract void. Explained with the help of statutory provisions and illustrations. So first we'll start with the introduction. Frustration in general scenario means defeated, and this term has been widely used in agreements and contracts between parties. The term frustration is being used to deal with unsuccessful transaction which could not be completed due to any reason. And then we'll come to doctrine of frustration, which is given under section 56 of the Contract Act. It says that under this doctrine, a promisor is relieved of any liability under the contract in the event of the breach of contract, and contract will be deemed to be void. So the basis of the doctrine was explained by the Supreme Court in the case of Satyabrata Ghosh versus Mungnira. In the well-known case of Taylor versus Caldwell, the defendants agreed to allow the plaintiff to use a music hall to conduct a concert for a few days, but before the performance of the concert, the hall was destroyed by fire without the fault of either party. The plaintiffs sued for their loss. The court quashed their argument, stating that the performance of the contract has become physically impossible because of the destruction of the subject matter, that is the music hall in this case. Then initial impossibility. So section 56 deals with both initial and subsequent impossibility. Let us read. Section 56 of the Indian Contract Act 1872 begins by laying down a straightforward principle that an agreement to do an impossible act is it itself in void. Like for instance, an agreement to discover treasure by magic because of its impossibility of performance is void. An agreement to do an act that is impossible from the very beginning, whether the parties were aware of such impossibility or not, the agreement will be void. And the subsequent is like giving you an example. A agrees to sell a tract of land to B, but owing to some governmental policy, this tract of land has been taken by the government or some official purpose. The agreement stands frustrated and B cannot sue A for non-performance of his obligation, as the performance of A's duty has become impossible. Then comes commercial hardship. So let me tell you one thing, commercial hardship doesn't come under doctrine of frustration. So this is a separate part. Sometimes there may be alteration to situation where performance is not practically cut off but only rendered more difficult or costly. Such cases do not fall under the scope of section 56, and this is amply shown in the case of, this is the case in which it has been held that commercial hardship doesn't fall under section 56, that is doctrine of frustration. This is Sachindra Nath versus Gopal Chandra. There are specific grounds of frustration. Then there is the ground first, death or incapacity of party. This is the famous case is Robinson versus Davis and Wyatt. There was a contract between the plaintiff and the defendant wife who agreed to perform piano at a concert of the plaintiff on a stipulated date. But due to sudden illness, she was unable to perform at the concert, and this was informed to the plaintiffs on the morning of the date of performance. This caused the concert to be postponed and caused loss to the plaintiff. See, the plaintiff filed for breach of contract. The court quashed their claim and said that the contract was frustrated as she became ill without there being any mistake or negligence on her part. Then comes government legislative and administrative interventions. The landmark case is Man Singh versus Khajan Singh, where certain parties agreed to the sale of trees of a certain forest, and the government of Rajasthan passed an order which forbade the cutting of trees in that area. The contract was held frustrated as it became unlawful subsequent to entering into a contract owing to governmental order. Then third, non-occurrence of contemplated event. So the landmark judgment is Krell versus Henry. A room was hired specifically to view the king's coronation procession, but the contract was held frustrated as the coronation was postponed. To get such a result, one has to show that the non-occurrence of the event was of such a nature that it forms the heart of the contract, and non-occurrence uproots the very foundation of the contract. And the other grounds are change of circumstance and the fifth number, destruction of subject matter. Then effects of frustration. What are the effects? Frustration should not be self-induced. So this means one of the main conditions required to clear frustration that it should not be self-induced. The principle was best explained in the case of Maritime National Fish Limited versus Ocean Trawlers Limited. The restitution under frustration and the provision of restitution has been given under section 65 of Contract Act. Obligation of party who has received advantage under void agreement or contract that becomes void. When an agreement is discovered to be void or when a contract becomes void, any person who has received any advantage under such agreement or contract is bound to restore it or to make compensation for it to the person from whom he received it. Then comes the conclusion part. The doctrine of frustration as provided under section 56 of the Indian Contract Act 1872 is an exception to the general rule of contract where compensation is provided in case of a loss. So overall we have understood, like generally this is a principle of Indian Contract Act that when a breach takes place, compensation is claimed, but doctrine of frustration is actually an exception to the rule. Hence it can be understood that a contract gets frustrated when without the fault of either of the parties the performance of the contract becomes impossible. Then question number 3, 7 more questions to go. So I am dealing with you the entire paper that contains 10 questions. The Article 20 of the Indian Constitution guarantees protection in respect of conviction for offences. Examine its nature and ambit. Introduction. As per Indian Constitution, Article 20, protection in respect of conviction for offences in the Constitution of India, it says, so let us read. No person shall be convicted of any offence except for violation of the law in force at the time of the commission of the act charged as an offence, nor be subjected to a penalty greater than that which might have been inflicted under the law in force at the time of commission of the offence. So the first clause actually talks about ex post facto laws. It talks about that the operation of law cannot be retrospective. Second, no person shall be prosecuted and punished for the offence more than once. It talks about the maxim atrophos convict and atrophos acquit. Then no person accused of any offence shall be compelled to be a witness against himself. In Article 20 contains provisions relating to ex post facto law, the doctrine of double jeopardy, and prohibition against self-incrimination. Then provision against ex post facto law, that is the prohibition of retrospective effect of penal offences. It has been given in clause 1 of Article 20. The provision in question, that is Article 20 clause 1, says that one must not be prosecuted and convicted in accordance with those laws which didn't exist at the time of the commission of the offence by the accused, and also must not be inflicted with punishment greater than those existed at the time of commission. So the landmark judgment is Kedarnath versus State of West Bengal. So ex post facto law only says that suppose if a person is convicted of a crime, so and later on he cannot be convicted for an enhanced punishment. Suppose if a law is passed which actually prescribes for the offence which he has committed long back an enhanced punishment, that person cannot be tried twice for the enhanced punishment. Then Kedarnath versus State of West Bengal. In this case, the Honorable Supreme Court of India observed that whenever an act is declared as a criminal offence and or provides penalty for some by the legislation, it is always prospective in nature and cannot be implemented retrospectively to uphold that is being said under Article 20 clause 1. But there is an exception in the case of Ratanlal versus State of Punjab, in which the Supreme Court allowed for such retrospective implementation of criminal laws where the issue pertinent is reduction of punishment in the said offence. But in the case if the punishment is relating to if a question involves whether the punishment should be reduced or not, then he can be tried retrospectively. Then double jeopardy. So fundamental right which is guaranteed under Article 20 clause 2 of Constitution of India incorporates the principles of atrophos convict or double jeopardy, which means that person must not be punished twice for the same offence. It is also based on the maxim nemo debet bis vexeri si constrat curi se cured sit pro una iti iedem causa. No man shall be punished twice if it appears to the court that it is for the one and the same cause. So there are landmark judgments regarding to this. Venkata Raman versus Union of India and Maqbul Hussain versus State of Bombay. You can pause the video and read by your own. Then there is exception. Nonetheless, there exists no exception to this provision, that is the principle of issue estoppel. The above mentioned exception provides for estoppel against the ongoing prosecution if the fact finding happens to be in favor of accused. But it doesn't bar from subsequent proceedings for a different offence. Suppose if a different offence has been committed, then the estoppel is actually not applicable. There exists an exception to this provision, that is a principle of issue estoppel. So this is the exception. And the landmark case relating to this maxim is Ravinder Singh versus Sukhbir Singh. Then prohibition against self-incrimination clause 3 of Article 20. Another foremost rule which provides for protection from a conviction for offences is prohibition against self-incrimination. The same is provided by the Constitution of India Part 3 under Article 20 clause 3. It describes that no one should be forced to utter and provide such information or evidence orally or by documentary means which could be used against himself during the further trial. So the person who is accused of an offence cannot be asked to make any statement which is against his which is actually against him, Also, the term witness, both oral and documentary evidence, as held in MP Sharma versus Satish Chandra, relevant judgment, as held in the same case. However, there is no restriction where a search for document or seizure is being done by the authorities. However, the information and evidence produced voluntarily by the accused is permissible. Suppose if the evidence has been produced by the accused voluntarily, then it is admissible. An exception to this rule is actually Section 27 of Evidence Act and Section 91 of CRPC, which gives authority to a court or an officer to issue an order demanding documents that were under the possession of the accused. So let us come to the conclusion. Article 20 clause 1, which speaks about ex post facto laws, Article 20 clause 2, which speaks about double jeopardy, and Article 20 clause 3, which speaks against self-incrimination, reflects protection of accused and convicted person from excesses of legislation, judicial and executive actions respectively. Also, these protections are available to all the people, that is Indian as well as foreigners, and thus forms the bedrock of the Indian Constitution and guarantees basic human right to the convicted and accused people. Then comes questions relating to jurisprudence. According to Kelsen, an efficacy of basic norm or grand norm is based upon the efficacy of the legal order. Explain this theory. So the question is about, you have to explain the viewpoint of Kelsen, which he says that an efficacy of basic norm or grand norm is based upon the efficacy of the legal order. You have to elaborate his statement. Introduction. First of all, we start with introduction. Hans Kelsen is known for the most rigorous development of a positivist theory of law. His theory excludes the analysis of any ethical, historical or political consideration and rather finds the essence of the legal order in the written or laid down laws. So he actually favors the written or laid down laws. The whole legal system is based on grand norm or basic norm, through which other statements of law flows. The basic rule might be based on some propositions such as those of the sovereign are to be obeyed. Now we will study about what did he mean by grand norm. Norms are regulations setting forth the behavior of a person, and positive law is thus a normative, an order regulating human conduct in a specific way. A norm is a thought to proposition. It expresses what, not what is or must be, but ought to be. So he is actually the propounder of law which is ought to be, given in certain conditions. Its existence can only mean its validity, and this exemplifies its connection with the system of norm which it forms a part. So according to norms are regulations setting forth the behavior of a person, and positive law is nothing but it is regulating the human conduct in a specific way. Kelsen used the word grand norm to denote the basic norm, order or rule that forms an underlying basis for legal system. Austin defines law as command backed by sanction. However, Kelsen disagreed in two ways. Firstly, he rejected the idea of command because it introduces a psychological element into a theory of law which should in its view be pure. And secondly, according to Austin, sanction was something that is outside the law, imparting its validity. So Kelsen is actually against the viewpoint of Austin. To Kelsen, such a statement is irrelevant and it doesn't make any sense, for the operation of the sanction supporting a rule revolves itself into the operation of other rules, and further the validity of a rule has nothing to do with the sanctions. So he actually didn't favor the sanction rule. For Kelsen, the operation of a sanction depends on the operation of other rules of law. Kelsen's solutions regarding the hierarchy of oughts, which is traceable to some initial fundamental ought on which the validity of all others ultimately rests. Therefore, it is known as the basic norm or grand norm. So grand norm is something, it is the main law, or say that it is a basic norm from which the other law has derived its existence. The principle of effectiveness. Kelsen theory, like the question is asking about efficacy. Efficacy is nothing but the principle of effectiveness he talks in his statement. Kelsen's theory distinguishes between the principle of validity and the principle of effectiveness. According to him, every norm other than grand norm is valid not because it is likely to be obeyed, but by virtue of another norm that imparts its validity. The efficacy of all the legal order is a necessary legal condition for the validity of every single norm of the order. These norms are valid not because the total order is efficacy, but because they are created in a constitutional way. Therefore, it will seem that with reference to a given norm, its validity and effectiveness must be kept separate. So, a law's validity and law's effectiveness are totally separate. Effectiveness of the whole legal order is a condition and not a reason for the validity of the grand norm or any other norm. So he says that the effectiveness of the legal order is actually a condition, not a reason for the validity of the ground norm. Change of the basic norm. So it is just a phenomenon of revolution which clearly signifies the importance of the basic norm. Suppose a group of people attempt to seize power by force in order to introduce a republican form of government and remove the legitimate government in a monarchical state. If they succeed, the new order begins to be efficacious because the behavior of the people was in conformity with the new order and which is considered to be valid. So basic law can also be changed. Like in the case of if a group of people actually overpowers a monarchical state, then in that they themselves establish a new law, then that becomes a basic law. Then comes conclusion. The scope of Kelsey's theory is completely different from that of Austin. According to the law, can we define in terms of certain norms? The whole legal system is interconnected with different norms, and there is a basic norm that is known as ground norm. All other norms are derived from the ground norm. It is always constitutional in nature, and although it is entirely formal, it forms the main basis of the legal system, like our constitution. In India, Kelsey's theory plays a vital role in the Indian constitution. All other laws derive their validity from the Indian constitution. If any law is unconstitutional, it can be struck down and declared to be null and void. Hence, Kelsey's theory plays a crucial role in the modern world also. Now we'll move to question number 5. The doctrine of indoor management seeks to protect third parties. So I hope you're understanding the questions. If you have any doubt, you can share the same in the comment section below. The doctrine of indoor management seeks to protect third parties against the company. Comment, are there any exceptions to the sale rule? Very, very important question. So first let's start with the introduction. The doctrine of indoor management lays down that persons dealing with the company having satisfied themselves that the proposed transaction is not in its nature inconsistent with the memorandum and articles are not bound to inquire the regularity of any internal proceedings. In other words, while persons contracting with the company are presumed to know the provisions of the contents of the memorandum and articles, they are entitled to assume that the officers of the company have observed the provisions of the article. It is no part of duty of any outsider to see that company carries out its own internal regulations. So doctrine of indoor management actually protects the outsiders from the internal matters of the internal matters of the company. The rule of doctrine of indoor management is conflicting to that of the principle of constructive notice. The latter seeks to protect the company against the outsiders. The former operates to protect outsiders against the company. So doctrine of indoor management actually seeks to protect outsiders against the company. So let us speak about its origin. Very important. The doctrine of indoor management has originated from an English case called Royal British Bank versus Turquoise. Hence, the alternative name to this doctrine is the Turquoise rule. So, doctrine of indoor management, also known as Turquoise rule, because it has been originated in the case of Royal British Bank versus Turquoise. Very, very important case law. In this case, the directors of the company had been authorized by the articles to borrow on bonds that sum of money as they should from time to time by passing a special resolution in a general meeting of the company. A bond under the seal of the company which was signed by the secretary and the two directors were given to the plaintiff to draw on the current account without the authority of any resolution. Turquoise sought to bind the company's action on the basis of such bond. Thus, the main question in this matter was whether the company can be held liable for that bond. The court in this case held that the bond was binding on the company, as Turquoise was entitled to presume that the resolution of the company has been passed in the general meeting, because in this rule the outsiders are not actually assumed that they already have the knowledge of the memorandum and articles of the company, and also they shall not inquire about the internal matters or the internal procedures of the company. The memorandum and articles of association are public documents and hence can be inspected by the public, but whatever is happening internally in the company is not known to the public. An outsider is oblivious to the internal procedure of the company, and hence outsiders are entitled to presume that all the internal procedures are catered by the company. So this is the reason why this rule says that the outsider of the company is required to inquire about the internal matter, internal procedures of the company, and they shall assume that the company has followed all the obligations that has been given under Articles of Association and Memorandum of Association. Application of the rule by the Indian courts. So let us read about the case laws of Indian courts. This Lakshmi Ratan Cotton Mills Company Limited versus JK Jute Mills Company and other. So you may read the same. In this case, the Indian court has actually followed the Turquoise case rule of Doctrine of Indoor Management. And then positions under the Indian companies. So where it has been provided. So it has been provided under Section 290 of the Companies Act, which deals with validity of acts of director. It says, acts done by a person as a director can be valid, notwithstanding that later it may be discovered that his appointment was invalid due to any disqualification or defect, or was terminated by any provision of the Act of the Articles, provided that nothing in the section shall give validity to any of the acts done by a director after his appointment has been shown to be company to be invalid or terminated. So, then there are exceptions to the Doctrine of Indoor Management. So, what are the exceptions? Knowledge of irregularity. So, it says, when an outsider who is entering into a transaction with a company has constructive or actual notice of the irregularity in relation to the internal management of the company, then he or she cannot seek remedy under the Doctrine of Indoor Management. So, the remedy of Doctrine of Indoor Management can be sought only by the persons who are actually unknown about the irregularities of the company, but suppose they already have the knowledge of the irregularities, then they cannot seek the advantages or the remedy under the Doctrine of Indoor Management. The case is Devi Dittamal versus the Standard Bank of India, where transfer of shares was approved by two directors, one of whom within the knowledge of the transferor was disqualified by reason of being the transferee himself, and the other was never validly appointed. The transfer was held to be ineffective. Then suspicion of irregularity. If the person already has the suspicion of the irregularity that is happening in the company. The protection of the Turquoise is also not available where the circumstances surrounding the contract are suspicious and therefore invite inquiry. So the relevant case law is Anand Bihari Lal versus Dinshaw and Company. You can read the same. Then comes forgery. Forgery main circumstances exclude the Turquoise rule. The only clear illustration is found in the Rubin versus Great Fingal Consolidates. Here in this case, the plaintiff was the transferee of a share certificate issued under the defendant's company. The company secretary who had affixed the seal of the company and forged the signature of the two directors issued the certificate. The plaintiff contended that whether the signature was genuine or forged, a part of the internal management, and therefore the company should be stopped from denying genuineness of the document. But it was held that the rule has never been extended to cover such a complete forgery. So these are reasons why forgery actually excludes the remedy of Turquoise rule. Then representation through articles. The exception deals with the most controversial and highly confusing aspect of the Turquoise rule. Articles of association generally contain what is called the power of delegation. It has been dealt in the case of Lakshmi Ratan Lal Cotton Mills versus JK Jute Mills Company. Explains the meaning and effect of a delegation clause. So let us read. Here one G was director of the company. The company had managing agents of which also G was a director. Articles authorized directors to borrow money and also empowered them to delegate this power to any or more of them. G borrowed a sum of money from plaintiffs. The company refused to be bound by the loan on the ground that there was no resolution of the board delegating the powers to borrow to G. Yet the company was held bound by the laws. Why? Because even supposing that there was no actual resolution authorizing Z to enter into the transaction, the plaintiff could assume that a power which could have been delegated under the articles must have been actually conferred. The actual delegation being a matter of internal management, the plaintiff was not bound to enter into that. Thus, the effect of a delegation clause is that a person who contracts with an individual director of a company, knowing that the board has power to delegate its authority to such an individual, may assume that the power of delegation has been exercised. So, this is also one of the rule of representation through articles. Then acts outside apparent authority. This is the last one. Lastly, if the act of an officer of a company is one which would ordinarily be beyond the power of such an officer, the plaintiff cannot claim the protection of the Turcon simply because under the article, power to do the act could have been delegated to him. In such a case, a plaintiff cannot sue the company unless the power has in fact been delegated to the officer with whom he dealt. So the famous the case law regarding to this is Anand Bihari Lal versus Dinshaw. Then we'll come to conclusion. The case of Royal British Bank versus Turquoise define the basic common law of agency to articulate the doctrine of indoor management. The rule was enunciated by the court to mitigate the rigors of the constructive notice doctrine. Its importance arises in which the third party's dealings are with some officer or agent other than the board. So it can also, this ground can only be taken as a remedy when the dealing is with some officer or agent of the company but other than the board of the company. The rule protects the interest of the third party who transacts with the company in good faith and to whom the company is indebted. The rule enunciated in the decision is often referred to as the Turquoise rule and indoor management rule. So this rule is also known as Turquoise rules or indoor management rule. The gist of the rule is that persons dealing with limited liability companies are not bound to inquire into their indoor management. So in short, you shall know that the gist of the rule is only that if a person is dealing with a company, he is not bound to inquire into the indoor management and will not be affected by the irregularities of which they had no notice. The rule enunciated in Turquoise has been applied in many cases subsequently and generally in order to protect the interest of the party transacting with the directors of the company. So, doctrine of constructive notice is, protects the company against the outsiders, and doctrine of indoor management protects the outsider against the irregularities of the company. Then we'll this is the part 1 of the video. The next 5 questions, these questions I will be dealing with you in the next part. So I hope you like this video. Kindly give a thumbs up to this video and also like and subscribe to the channel among others. And if you have any doubts and queries, you can share the same in the comment section below. Thank you.